Morning. Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Eric Langenbacher, the director of the Society, Culture, and Politics program at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. I'd like to welcome you to today's event. This is part of a series that AICGS has been doing since January, devoted to the upcoming September Bundestag election. I would encourage you to check out the dozens of recordings and articles that we have on our website. We also have a new page on our website that's devoted to understanding the German political system, the electoral system. We have information on the party platforms up there, and we will continue to add to that as kind of a background briefing. But today we're going to be talking about the Greens, and we are very, very happy to have this webinar. I should also note that this series is supported by the Harry and Helen Gray Culture and Politics program and the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany. And we're doing this in partnership with the Aston Center for Europe at Aston University in the UK, the International Association for the Study of German Politics, and the BMW Center for German and European Studies at Georgetown University. So today we're talking about the comeback kids, the September 26th election, and the Green Party's path to government. And I couldn't think of a more topical webinar, given how polling is evolving with the Greens' advantage very quickly going away. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to AICGS President Jeff Rathke.
Thank you very much, Eric, and great to have so many people with us this morning. I am really delighted to have this webinar for all the reasons Eric said, but also because this is a particularly busy week when it comes to Germany and the relationship with the United States. We have our webinar today. Tomorrow, AICGS will host another webinar with the chairman of the Bundestag Foreign Affairs Committee, Dr. Norbert Röttgen, who was a candidate for the CDU chairmanship earlier this year. And on Thursday, Johns Hopkins University will present an honorary doctorate to Chancellor Merkel during her visit to Washington, D.C. That event will be carried through live stream, and you can follow the AICGS website if you want to listen to her remarks and follow that event. But that's later this week. Today, we're talking about the Greens and the September 26th election for the Bundestag. I'd like to set the stage, but first, I just want to introduce our special guest, Peter Unfried, who is the chief reporter of the Taz, which is one of Germany's best newspapers for following the Greens, and he is a person who has followed them for many, many years. So we are especially grateful to have his insights today. Peter, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for having me.
And if I understand correctly, this may be your American webinar debut. If so, I'm honored that we can be the host for it.
Yeah, it's great. It's the first time for me. So thanks again for having me.
Okay. Well, I would like to set the stage for our discussion. And before I do that, one bit of housekeeping. We will use the Q&A function in Zoom, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. But just a reminder, if you have a question, please use the Q&A box. Please make it brief. Please make it a question, and we will do our best to take as many questions as we can when we go through the conversation. But first, let me set the stage for the discussion. We've been, of course, those of you who are following the German election campaign will recall that it's been a dramatic turnaround in just the last couple of months. In the middle of the spring, in April and May, the Green Party was leading in the polls. They were a few points ahead of the CDU-CSU. And you can see this in the chart that you've got on your screen. The green line, of course, representing the Green Party, the black line, the CDU-CSU. And I've also I highlighted a few mileposts here, which will be in some ways points of reference in our conversation. the Green Party was starting strong. You will also see that there have been at least 3 major setbacks for the party during this election campaign. Their leading candidate, Annalena Baerbock, who is co-chairman of the party. First, there was a report, there was a need to update her income report, which was a little bit embarrassing for a party that has typically had the image of being kind of on the straight and narrow and very interested in transparency. In June, there were reports that emerged about some exaggerations in her resume. Also caused some embarrassment. And just a couple of weeks ago, there were allegations in the media that some parts of the book Annalena Baerbock just released were plagiarized. So you see these setbacks as part of an overall downward trend for the Greens. And now we've got a situation where the Greens are trailing by the CDU-CSU by quite a bit. The next slide, we will look at the most recent polling numbers. These are the 2 most recent polls. On the left, you see a poll from INSA, which came out yesterday, and that has the CDU-CSU at 28%. And remarkably, it has the Greens and the Social Democrats tied at 17%. This is the first time in quite a while that those 2 parties have been at the same level in the polls. The Greens had been well ahead for quite some time. There is another poll which came out just a couple of days ago, which has slightly different figures, and it still has the Greens in second place by a notable margin. But the overall trend of the gap narrowing between the Greens and the SPD is quite clear. And then the last slide we'll look at before we get into the discussion. This is a little bit of a reference point for 2013. Those of you who follow German politics might recall that before the 2013 election, the Greens were doing quite well in public opinion. You'll see they were hovering at around 15% for the almost the entirety of 2013, and then their support crashed. It was cut by about half by the time of the election, a very disappointing result at that time for the Greens. So there's a little bit of history here. And then the question that we'll start with perhaps today, if we can take this, the slides down, we'll come back to this one in a little bit, is Peter Unfried. Why are the Greens encountering trouble in this election campaign? Is it just a few embarrassing revelations, or is there something else that's going on here, in your opinion?
Well, obviously, it's the candidate that's in the middle of the turmoil, and there she made mistakes. There's no question about that. But behind that, we have to see that we're right in the middle of a major change in German society and politics. The social democracy and the Christ democracy, they are no longer able to, well, solve the problems that are getting more and more imminent. And so also the society has changed, and we have a new middle class. And the new middle class, it took them, let's say, 20 years to realize that there is no party for them, because we had this SPD and CDU. And the Greens, they were coming from, a corner, really. So used to be a radical party, outsiders. And only when Robert Habeck and Annalena Baerbock took charge of the Green Party in Berlin, the new middle class began to realize that the Greens could be their party. So that's the reason why they started growing from 8% to 24%. And now this is sort of in danger, because obviously other parties and other parts of societies are not really interested in mighty Greens. So they're fighting back now, and we're in the middle of that fight right now.
Mm-hmm. There have been some. Well, I'll come to the fairness question in a minute. But first, I think it's, as you mentioned, this change of the Greens' public profile and their public appeal. has not been an accident. It was part of a deliberate strategy by the co-chairs of the party, Robert Habeck and Annalena Baerbock, to to seek greater support in the middle of German society. And until recently, it seemed that that had been a fantastically successful policy. Was that an illusion in your view, how do you see that success that seemed to accompany the leadership of Baerbock and Habeck for all of these years?
Well, whether it's an illusion, we'll only find out when the Greens eventually get into power. They will. The question is only whether they'll do it in 21 or in 25. But they will. But whether they really have the answers, we'll have to find out. But the thing is actually that people who were starting to to get convinced by Habeck and Baerbock, but also to convince themselves that the Greens could have the answers that obviously the CDU and the SPD doesn't have any longer. They are now starting to doubt whether this is really true. And this is behind the Baerbock scandal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which, you use the word scandal. If you actually take a look at the substance of the of these embarrassing incidents, they're not particularly grave compared to other kinds of scandals. So, do you think this is being blown out of proportion in some way? Do you think that people hold the Greens to a higher standard, and therefore the damage is greater, even if the offense, if you want to call it that, is minor?
Well, in election time, Jeff, everything's drawn out of proportion. So this is not really surprising. But the problem is really that if you really want to, the Greens are basically the only party in Germany that are running on a change platform. The other parties will basically say it's okay and will continue as we have been doing for many, many years. So if you want to change and you have a society that's partly ready to change, but only partly, you need credibility. So, and that's the most important thing for climate policy. You need credibility, that people have the feeling, okay, we can trust those guys and let's give it a shot. So, and this credibility now is in danger because the Greens have decided to, Annalena Baerbock has decided to run for chancellor. And now she's sort of the pars pro toto for climate policy. And that could have been an advantage, but it's a disadvantage now.
Okay. So I want to come back to this fairness issue, because there have been some objections, especially from members of the Green Party and some of their leading figures, who have claimed that these attacks and the standards to which Baerbock is being held, that it is fundamentally unfair. And so on the one hand, I'd be interested whether you agree with that assessment, but maybe more fundamentally, is that even the right question? Should you expect fairness in an election campaign?
Well, that's obviously a rhetorical question. No, you can't and you shouldn't. I mean, even if I was under the assumption that it's totally unfair, I wouldn't talk about it because it's not clever to do so. And some of those Greens, they're even trying to compare the situation with Trumpism and the US election. And this is really ridiculous. I think this is a rhetoric for losers, really. So I can only, ask them or I can only say that's not a good way to do things. You shouldn't do that. It's difficult now because, as I've said, credibility has been lost, and it's really difficult to get back into a winning situation. But moaning and mithering will only make things worse.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, very clear. So with that, I'd like to come back to another point that you made in your, I think, your first response. and that is about the broader cultural and political situation in which Germany finds itself,
Yeah.
and how that aligns with the Greens' politics and many of the Greens' priorities. Because, as you said, it's really a question. The Greens have positioned themselves as a party of change. Now, perhaps they've softened that a little bit so that they are a party not of radical change, but of achievable change. I think that's one of the differences between the 2021 campaign and perhaps previous campaigns. In fact, there's even one of the slogans, which I'm forgetting the exact wording of it, but is basically, change makes makes stability possible. How was it? So they've tried to balance the prescription for change with the implication that it's not going to be too difficult for anybody to embark upon this course of change. But is Germany ready for change at all? As you said, Peter, most of the other parties are campaigning on the ways that they would preserve the status quo. Have the Greens fundamentally misunderstood this cultural and political moment in Germany?
No, I think they got it correctly most of the time. I mean, what you have to understand, especially us lefties, liberals. So our paper is a liberal paper or a leftist paper, and we want it all, and we want it now. And what we tend to forget is that you need a majority in a democracy, and that's a good thing. So, and there's a deep distrust on the left side that the majority can't basically do the right things. But if you don't have the majority, you can't do anything at all. So we have a situation in Germany that the CDU has been in government most of the time for the last 70 years. And they have been doing so because basically they don't trust people also, but they're also not telling them that they have to make any sacrifices. So this is basically, if you want to lose, you have to tell people that they have to make sacrifices. So what especially people from the left side are telling the Greens that they have to get real, that they have to tell people how worse it's going to be, and that they have to pay for it, and they have to sell their car and everything. And you can do that, but you will never win any elections. So what Baerbock and especially Robert Habeck have been doing, and of course the Prime Minister of Baden-Württemberg, the Green Prime Minister, one and only Prime Minister, Winfried Kretschmann, is building confidence in the center of society, in the middle of society, in the public mainstream, who have always been thinking that the Greens are sort of strange people and they're never going to vote for those strange Greens. And they have changed that. And they can only do that if they're ready to accept that people will only move forward very slowly and very carefully. And at this point, we had, or not at this point, but 3 or 4 months ago, we had sort of 25% of German society ready to move forward slowly, and even more important, to accept that if you have 25%, you need another 25% who even less willing to move forward, but who are willing to make an alliance together, because this thing needs to be done together, because climate change, climate policy is not a minority project, but it's sort of necessary that everybody stands behind it, or at least, well, 50% won't even do. You need 60 or 65% who are ready to accept that this is our priority now. So this has been really difficult to balance out. And I think especially Robert Habeck has been doing very well in balancing out the will to change and the knowledge that it's gonna be a difficult and slow process. And at this point now, other people, other parties are trying to, well, this is their job, and it's okay that they're trying to destroy the new confidence that Habeck and Baerbock have been building up.
And then, as you say, there is, of course, in a political contest, you are going to be the target of criticism by your opponents, and that's exactly what is happening. And maybe that shocked people in the Green Party who had been accustomed to this very favorable kind of reputation and image they had achieved in recent years, but it's still a fundamental fact of political competition. So do you think there is an opportunity to recover some of this ground they have lost in the last month or two? Or are they on sort of a hopeless slide downward that they will be unable to reverse?
Well, nobody knows, Jeff. And I've been talking to Greens and to other journalists about that issue for days now. And this is really difficult. And basically, for me, there are two possibilities or two theories that I have. The one theory is the Greens have always been the outsider in the race. And now the imagination or the spin doctors of the other parties have tried to create the illusion that the Greens are basically the favorite. And even the CDU is really great in pretending that the Greens have been in power for 20 years and by doing all those bad things, forbidding stuff and punishing people and everything. And reality, of course, is that the CDU has been in power since 2005 and probably 55 of the last 70 years. I don't know exactly at this point, but so this means the Greens have to remind the public that they are the outsiders and the possibly the nice little sympathetic outsider in this race and not the bad guy that nobody likes. And the second theory, that's my own personal theory, is that basically only Annalena Baerbock can change the situation because she's in the middle of the distrust right now. And it's her job to talk and to talk differently in order to, well, change the tide, because people have started to not trust the Greens because they don't know exactly what happened with all those stuff with Annalena Baerbock, but something has been happening, and so that this is the case right now. And what she needs is basically a big public appearance where she talks and she gets real, and at the end people think, oh, I think she's okay. I have listened. I've been listening to her, and I think she is okay, and she's not gonna cheat us. So, but this is gonna be difficult.
So there's sort of a tactical element, which is how Annalena Baerbock should address the kind of mounting doubts about her candidacy. But then there's the more fundamental question of repositioning the Greens as an underdog, as a party of change.
Yeah, Jeff, sorry, but that means less Annalena Baerbock.
Right. So these things are in tension. That's exactly the issue, I think, is the solution to one in one way is more Annalena Baerbock, and or the solution is in another way to have less of Annalena Baerbock and more of the Greens as the outsiders.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's not more Annalena Baerbock, but a different Annalena Baerbock.
Okay. Yes, that's that's better. That's better said. Now, there's also it comes back though to this question of whether German voters are ready for policies that would require some sacrifice. I think it's clear that the Greens' argument is that, especially when you look at the climate crisis, that waiting longer to take action is unacceptable and is irresponsible. I think that would be the argument. And therefore, it's necessary for Germany and the other developed economies, along with the entire world, to take more consequential action. That is, I think, a coherent position. I just wonder whether, and perhaps it was also very appealing at a time when Germany was going through the pandemic, when the fragility of our way of life seemed more apparent, maybe. And now, as things return to some kind of more regular routine, as Germans go on their summer holidays, perhaps, as that people perhaps sigh and say, "Whew, I'm glad that's over. And now we can just get back to living our lives the way we did before 2020." That seems like a real risk at this particular moment.
Yeah, that's a very deep desire. I mean, even I have it, of course. So going back to normal, and then you have politicians, Green politicians, there won't be any back to normal, which is true. And rationally, I can grasp that. But emotionally, it's very hard. And I don't want to do that because I want to go back to my normal life. And so the question really is how much change you can actually how much change you can offer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'd say not much.
Mm-hmm. There was an article you wrote recently in which you talked about the ways that the green message has to appeal not only to young urban voters who, among whom the Greens are quite popular right now, but also to, as you put it, I think, the grandfather who cares about a 2-cent change in the gasoline price. Perhaps because he just doesn't like to pay more for gasoline, or maybe because his profession and his mobility really depends on the cost of transportation. And is there, how in your view can the Greens address that clientele? You've said it needs to be maybe a little bit less change, but is it also a different type of change than they've been emphasizing?
Well, I think there are two possibilities. The one possibility is, and that I'd say classical Green would like to do so, is to get into detail and explain everything, how hard it's going to be, how much gas prices will be rising in the next 15 years, and so on and so on. And you lose loads and loads of people because, as I've said, grandpa, well, even if he has the money, he really likes to buy cheap gasoline. So
yeah,
that's his thing. Okay. And so I think the better thing, what you have to do is to win a majority that is willing to, well, basically say, okay, let's do this thing. We don't know exactly how we're going to do it. This is the job of the next government, but I'm in. We're going to do this thing in the next 20 years. So in Germany, it's a good thing that a friend of mine usually says, it's in the last 70 years, no matter whether the CDU, the SPD, or whoever was in government, every government knew that they had to fight unemployment. This was basically common sense in German society, and it was minimum standard for each and every government. Mm-hmm. And the idea basically is to say to fight climate crisis and climate policy, it's the same thing. So it's a standard, it's the basic, and that's what we're doing. That's our job. This is who we are. Germany to 2021. And so let's do it. And then we'll see and we'll talk about it and we'll argue and we'll even fight how we are going to do it. But we need a common yes for getting into action. And I think that's the only way to do it.
Okay. Let me switch to kind of what the numbers suggest at the moment and how they might develop. Right now, depending on which poll you look at, perhaps the Greens are in second place. Perhaps they have enough support that you could form a CDU-CSU coalition with the Greens, and they would have a narrow majority. Depending on the poll, that's at least conceivable. There's been an assumption, I think, that a so-called black-green government is the most likely outcome. Do you still share that, or do you hold that view? Do you think that's the most likely outcome, Peter?
Yes. Yes. I still think that probably if you have 30% who are going to vote for the CDU and maybe 18 to 20 for the Greens, so you will be having a black-green government. Of course, the FDP is more clever than they used to be in the past, and they are still a strong contender. So you could have what we call a Jamaica coalition. But I don't think at this point that this is really helpful. I think if you really want to have climate policy, less parties are better than more parties. The same, even a green chancellor with SPD and FDP, it's probably is going to be, although it could be alluring for the Greens and other parties, it's probably even more difficult than a black-green government.
Well, actually, so you've hinted at something I wanted to ask, and that is, you could have a mathematical possibility of a Green-led government, even if the Greens finish in second place, because the recovery of the numbers for the SPD and the strong numbers historically for the FDP might put you in a zone where the so-called traffic light coalition, that is Greens, SPD, and the Liberals, who have a yellow kind of trademark color, that they could form a government. But you seem to think that is unlikely. Is it because of the substantive differences, or is it out of more strategic consideration that would be harder to achieve?
Well, first of all, the three parties don't have much in common, really, although some people like to think they have. The FDP in a three-party coalition be really the nemesis of the Greens, and the SPD, they'd really be hurt if the Greens were leading this coalition. So it's really hard for them. So this is not really a coalition that would be happily formed. But I think more important, well, strategically, if in the end it's possible, you have to talk about it. But strategically, at this point, it's, in my assumption, people don't really fancy the idea of Annalena Baerbock becoming chancellor. So you shouldn't talk about that at all. And you should get back into the outsider role, and you should say, okay, let's get as strong as it's possible in order to make more climate policy possible. But we're not talking about overtaking the country, because this, well, I wasn't sure whether it would, but it obviously has given, well, it has. Well, the good thing was in the end, in the beginning, it seemed that people liked the idea, and you had people who were following the bandwagon because you had a young and green woman But now you see that on the other hand, you have lots of people who don't like the idea. So they're really fighting about the person and not about the issues. And to get back into the issues, you have to sort of, well, be careful whether you actually still talk about Chancellor Baerbock.
Okay, and that actually this brings me to another point, and maybe Liz, if we could pull up the slide that we didn't get to earlier, and that is this is the most recent poll on preferences for chancellors. That is, in other words, if people could vote directly for the chancellor, which they don't do in the German political system, but if they could, whom would they prefer? And this gives us an interesting perspective here, because we see, as you said, Peter, that Annalena Baerbock is in third place in that race, so to speak. But also in first place is Olaf Scholz from the Social Democratic Party, narrowly only. But I think that brings us to the point that is, Olaf Scholz is a very popular figure. He is a moderate, member of the Social Democratic Party. He's been a very competent finance minister, and therefore enjoys broad public support. If we remain in the situation we're in now, Peter, that the Social Democrats and the Greens are basically equal, do you think that this public support for for Olaf Scholz, could give a boost to the Social Democrats, and they basically wind up riding on the coattails of Olaf Scholz to a strong second place finish? And that kind of mixes up the political landscape quite significantly. Do you see that possibility?
Well, I don't see that at all, actually. What I see is that we have a tendency in Germany that we can see in each and any state election, that the title holder sort of is really the favorite, and nobody knows the contender. And in this case, people, well, they hardly know Armin Laschet, and they don't know Annalena Baerbock at all, or didn't know Annalena Baerbock at all, and they somehow know Olaf Scholz because he's the vice chancellor. And since Merkel's not running any longer, Olaf Scholz is sort of the title holder without a title. But since his party is so weak, people have trust in him because they think they know him, but the party is not strong enough, so he doesn't really stand a chance. It's the other way around with Armin Laschet. They really don't know him at this point, but they know the party. The party has been stable for centuries and centuries, so they're going to vote for the CDU. With Annalena Baerbock, the problem was that most people, even in Berlin or in green milieus, they didn't know her. So she was a new kid in town. She seemed to be a favorite, but then she had all this bad publicity, and also has made those mistakes. So the first thing that people get to know about Annalena Baerbock is that she has a problem, and she is a problem. So this is difficult, and that's why her numbers have dropped so rapidly right now. But it's the first time in, I don't know, probably since 1949 that there is no title holder in the race for the chancellorship. So this is a completely new situation. That's the reason why Robert Habeck actually invented this idea of running for chancellor, because he thought this could help to shift the cultural change. And it has done in a way. Cultural change, meaning that the Greens are no longer a small party, but they are now the party of the middle class, and they're sort of a real contender. And now,
and a party with ambition, the desire to govern.
Ambition, and also, as they claim, the knowledge to lead. So this is has also put into danger right now with the Baerbock problems. So, but I think that we have a learning society right now, And even if it's a setback now, people will get accustomed to the idea that the Greens are no longer the old Greens, as the other parties try to frame them, but they're the new Greens, as they themselves try to frame them, and that they're now sort of a new kind of possible Volkspartei, leading party. And this may pay off in this election or in the elections to come.
Okay, so thus far, we've talked about some of the coalition possibilities. One being black-green, that is CDU, CSU with the Greens, which you seem to think is the most likely outcome. You have expressed some doubts about the possibility of a Green-led government with the Social Democrats and the Liberal FDP. Are there other possibilities out there that you think are worth taking seriously at this stage? For example, there's if we look at Sachsen-Anhalt, you have a coalition there which is led by the CDU with the Social Democrats and the Liberals, which mirrors the colors of the German flag, so it's called a Deutschland coalition. Do you see other possibilities at the federal level emerging that are worth thinking about?
Well, at least, or first of all, I have to admit that I'm a climate policy guy. So climate policy first. I'm an Al Gore guy. So Al Gore movie has sort of changed my life, really, because I have started to understand the problem and how big the problem is. But yes, in my thinking, a possible coalition of CDU, SPD, and FDP is a sort of anti-climate policy coalition. That's a bit too strong, because they're gonna, I think in a way they have mildly understood the problem, and they're willing to tackle it politically, but only in an insufficient way. So what we're right now, what they're trying to do is saying the Greens are overreacting. We are the Maß and Mitte is the word in Germany. Don't know what the expression is in English, Maß and Mitte.
Yeah, let me come back to that. I'll have to think about that.
Okay, we're the sensible guys, and of course we've understood the problem and we'll face it, but don't worry, we won't bother you. So, and the question is whether not the majority of society, but the decisive part of society, let's say 10-15%, who are sort of torn between we have to tackle this and maybe there are more important issues right now, whether they'll switch to the anti-climate policy coalition or whether they'll switch to the no, we have to tackle it now side. So that's really what this election is all about. But we have a way, another option that our readers, as I've said, we're lefties, favor, and that's of course green, red, red.
Yeah.
So that's the Greens, the SPD, and the Linkspartei, and probably even more the SPD in power, Linkspartei for really social policy, and the Greens some sort of eco gadget that runs with it. Those are people who are still convinced that, well, basically Marx is the guy today, and we have to sort of change society or even the system. So, but I don't think this is going to happen because the Linkspartei, they're not really, sometimes they say they are, but in my opinion, they are not really ready and willing to govern. So,
yeah. But it's the possibility of a left-wing coalition is also in some ways a boogeyman, which is brought up frequently in this campaign, as it has been for
Yeah.
for many years,
Yeah.
and so there's also talking to some of my German acquaintances who are perhaps on a different side of the political spectrum than you, Peter, but they've said that if the Greens, until the Greens rule out a left-wing coalition, there will be this, fear among certain voters that they might vote for Annalena Baerbock, expecting, Schwarz-Grün, and instead they get a left-wing coalition, and that's a very, at least some people consider that a very powerful political weapon in this campaign. Do you've said you're a left-wing paper, of course, and so your readers would have a different view of that. But how do you assess that? Is there a risk, of course, a political risk that the Greens take on by keeping all of their options open?
No, I don't think so. I think this is really clever because, well, of course, this is the lamest trick of them all. They've been doing it, I don't think, for 70 years, right? Now it started in 1949, 1961, 1976. So people get used to it, but you can't rule out the possibility that even today still some people will fall for this trick. Can be possible, but in order to become the new center society party, the Greens have to create the image that basically everything revolves around them. So they have, of course, to be open to all sides of the spectrum, because they say, okay, we're Maas and Mitte right now.
Yeah.
And you can be sure that if we're in government, nothing bad or extreme or radical will happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got some questions that have come in. We have some in the Q&A box. I've also gotten one by email, which I'll start with that one. And the question is, the Greens are now participants. They were in power in the federal government for 7 years when Gerhard Schröder was chancellor, 1998 until 2005. And if you look at the map of Germany right now, the Greens are part of the governing coalition in 7 of Germany's states. They only lead one of them in Baden-Württemberg, as you said, but nevertheless, they've got a lot of experience in state-level government. So, what have the Greens achieved concretely in government, in your view? What are there standout accomplishments, policy accomplishments of the Greens?
Well, I think basically what's talking about Baden-Württemberg, which is, of course, Germany's California.
Yes.
And economically, but also politically, because they voted the Greens into power, and they have a new government now, led by a Green politician, Winfried Kretschmann, with the CDU as the small partner, really. And they have a climate policy legislation that is really, really good. So Kretschmann has been criticized rightly and correctly for years that he's not doing enough, and he's always been saying that, okay, I would, but the majority doesn't want, and I have coalition partners who are not ready to do it. And this time he was voted so strongly into office with 32% that the dwindling CDU had no other choice but to accept a climate policy package. And I think that's the way to do it. So you have to become strong yourself, and you have to be in the driver's seat, so you can make the rules. And I think that's the only way you can act also in other states in Germany in order to bring climate policy forward.
Mhm. Are there other states? Of course, Baden-Württemberg is in a way the best example because there is a Green minister president. Are there examples from other German states where the Greens have participated where you would consider there to be significant achievements and breakthroughs in climate policy, for example? Are there any that stand out in your mind?
Yeah, well, Schleswig-Holstein is another example where Robert Habeck used to be vice minister president,
Hmm.
and they've been doing quite good. Well, it's more difficult because it's a agricultural state, fisherman state, small state, well, a province really. It's not urban,
Hmm.
but well, he's managed to sort of make alliances with fishermen, with the Bauern, what's the word?
Farmers.
The farmers, sorry, yeah, with
Yeah.
farmers. So this has brought the Greens into a new position, really, being the trusted guys of normal people, working
Hmm.
class. So this is not huge in terms of effectiveness, but it's huge in cultural progress. And we
Okay.
have, on the other hand, Hessen, of course, which is difficult right now because they have 20%, CDU has more than 30%, and they're sort of not strong enough to make the rules, and they had to accept different policy areas, climate policy, but also interior security, innere Sicherheit, where they have not been doing so well. So they have been criticized very harshly. But the it's also, as I've tried to explain during our whole hour, that basically when the Greens are criticized, they're criticized for not being so radically as they used to be when they were not in power. And you can always be very radical when you're not in power. And once you're in power, you have to sort of talk to all the people, all the fractions, all the interested groups and so on. It's going to be even more difficult, and you have to make compromises. And compromise has always been in left and green thinking has been a bad word.
Yeah.
But you have to it's a good word if you do it properly, and that's the only thing that you can do is to make a social and a society compromise, and that's what the Habeck and Baerbock Greens have learned. And I don't think that's Verrat. What's that?
Well, betrayal.
That's betrayal of their original roots, but it's sort of a learning process. And that's the only way how you can actually do policy and bring things forward.
Right.
And they're right now at this point that they're trying to do that in the federal government.
Okay. So we have one question, which is about the whether whether there is a role that misogyny plays in some of the attacks against Annalena Baerbock. On the one hand, Germany has been governed by a chancellor for the last 16 years who is a woman. But do you, I know there's been a lot of debate about whether the attacks and allegations against Baerbock have also a misogynistic undertone. How do you view that?
Well, yes, there is this undertone, and we have some old misogynist guys, but it's not the majority of society, and they are trying to use it in order to split society. So I don't think this is really an argument that's worth following, and I think it's really weak if the Greens are trying to do so, because as I've said, it's the same with England now and those football fans. You have always those parts of society who have problems with progress, with women, with well, other races. But in generally, Germany has made a major progress talking about emancipation and liberation of society. And this is not Germany that We've now that we are seeing that, well, against Baerbock because she's a woman. I've just talked to a Linkspartei woman, and I said, okay, we have been having a woman in as chancellor for the last 15 years. She said, yes, but she's a conservative woman. And that's a point. That's a point, that there's a difference between a conservative woman and a more liberal and progressive woman. And I think that this could, you could talk about that, but it's not a question of a woman in general.
Okay, so we've got three questions that I want to take very quickly. The first one is that, as one listener points out, there have been some people who have called on Baerbock to step down as the chancellor candidate and for Habeck to become the chancellor candidate for the Greens. What do you think about that?
That's nonsense, because it's over. I mean, there won't be a Green chancellor, neither Baerbock or Habeck. And as I've said, they have to concentrate now on getting a really strong number two. That's the main issue. And the less they talk about the chancellorship, the more they have chances to get back into track. So stop talking about chancellorship.
Okay, got it. Second question. Is there enough time? You talked about the ways that Robert Habeck, as vice minister president in Schleswig-Holstein, has succeeded in reaching out to, let's say, the agricultural sector, as an example. And so the question is, do the Greens have enough time to shake off this elitist or sort of middle class, well-educated image? Is there of course are a lot of people in Germany who fear the impact of climate change, of digitalization, and of the changes that will bring to their professions and their position in society. How long will it take to change that image in the way you described?
Well, Jeff, I've just seen a picture from Eastern Germany, a poster, and it said, we've survived Hitler, we've survived Stalin, and we'll also survive the Greens. So it's going to be a really long way. So because the bad and negative images of Greens in some regions in Germany are very strong, but I think for the majority of Germans, this is no longer a problem. So they have to concentrate, of course, on the majority. And that this is not only a matter of urban and regional areas, but some people really like their cliches. So you should not take them away from them, because it's all they have.
Okay. And last question, which is from one of our astute viewers. If the Greens enter government after this election, in whatever capacity, and if Robert Habeck and Annalena Baerbock were to become ministers in a government, would they have to resign their positions as co-chairs of the party? And would that then lead to a struggle between sort of the moderate pragmatic wing and the more radical wing of the party?
Well, they would have to resign, of course. Once they're in the government, they can't be party chairs. But I don't think this is really a problem, because once the Greens are in power, the party chairs won't be really powerful anymore, because everything up from this point, as it used to be in the Fischer years, sort of the decisions, even the Green Party decisions, will be made in the Secretary of State office, or whichever office it will be.
Right. Okay. Well, this has been a fascinating hour, extremely informative, and I want to thank you, Peter Unfried, for being with us, for sharing your insights into the dynamics inside the Green Party in the unfolding election campaign, which will culminate in September, on September 26th. And it's been great to have you with us. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. And to all of our viewers, please follow us, and we will have more content on the German-American relationship, on the German election campaign, and on a whole host of other things. As I mentioned at the start, tomorrow, Norbert Röttgen. Maybe, Peter, you want to dial in and ask some questions of Norbert Röttgen?
I will.
Okay, very good. And on Thursday, Johns Hopkins University granting honorary doctorate to Angela Merkel during her visit to Washington. So follow us on the live stream, and we will see you all again soon. Thanks so much, and have a good day. Bye-bye.